Sandra walked out of the county jail at sunset the next day, carrying a plastic bag with her personal belongings and wearing the same clothes she had been arrested in a week earlier. The FBI had worked through the night to arrange her release, convincing the prosecutor that Sandra was essential to their investigation and that keeping her locked up would harm a federal case. Maya ran into her mother's arms the moment Sandra stepped through Mrs. Johnson's front door. The 8-year-old had been crying herself to sleep every night, not understanding why her mother had disappeared or when she might come home. "Mommy, I thought you were never coming back," Maya sobbed into Sandra's shoulder. "I'm here now, baby. Everything's going to be okay," Sandra whispered, though she knew that wasn't entirely true. The most dangerous part of this ordeal was just beginning. The next morning, Special Agent Martinez arrived at Sandra's apartment with a detailed plan. Sandra had agreed to help the FBI catch the identity theft ring, but she hadn't fully understood what that would involve until now. "We need you to act like you're investigating your own case," Agent Martinez explained as she set up surveillance equipment in Sandra's living room. "We want the criminals to think you're getting close to exposing them." Agent Johnson, who was monitoring radio communications from a van parked down the street, spoke through a small earpiece Sandra was wearing. "Our tech team has been tracking the digital footprints of this organization. They've been monitoring news coverage of all the arrests, including yours. They know when charges are dropped, when suspects are released, and when cases are dismissed." Sandra felt nervous about being used as bait, but she was also angry about what these people had done to her and the other innocent women. "What exactly do you want me to do?" "We've arranged for you to meet with an investigative journalist tomorrow," Agent Martinez said. "Her name is Patricia Wong, and she's been writing about wrongful arrests and police misconduct. The meeting is legitimate. She really wants to interview you about your case." Agent Cooper joined them from the surveillance van outside. "But we're going to make sure the criminals know about this meeting. We want them to think you're about to expose their operation to the media." "And then what happens? If we're right about how this organization works, they'll try to stop you from talking," Agent Martinez said grimly. "They might try to intimidate you, threaten you, or worse, but we'll be watching every move they make." Sandra spent the rest of the day trying to act normal, while federal agents installed hidden cameras and microphones throughout her apartment and workplace. Maya was staying with Mrs. Johnson again, both for her safety and to keep her away from the surveillance operation. The next afternoon, Sandra met Patricia Wong at a downtown coffee shop that the FBI had chosen because it had good sightlines for surveillance. The journalist was a sharp, determined woman in her 40s who had won awards for her investigative reporting on criminal justice issues. "Mrs. Williams, your case fits a pattern I've been investigating," Wong said as she recorded their conversation on her phone. "I've found at least 12 other women across the Midwest who were arrested for bank robberies they couldn't have committed." Sandra told her story while FBI agents watched from nearby tables and parked cars. She talked about the flawed eyewitness identification, the evidence that proved her innocence, and the way the police had ignored her alibi. What she didn't mention was the FBI investigation or the conspiracy they had uncovered. "I'm planning to publish this story next week," Wong said as their interview concluded. "It's going to raise serious questions about how these cases were handled." That evening, Sandra returned to her apartment and tried to go about her normal routine while wearing a wire, and knowing that federal agents were watching her every move. She made dinner, watched television, and talked to Maya on the phone, all while waiting for something to happen. Around 10 p.m., Sandra's phone rang. The caller ID showed unknown number. "Hello?" Sandra answered, her heart racing. "Sandra Williams?" The voice was electronically disguised, making it impossible to determine if the caller was male or female. "Yes, who is this?" "Someone who knows the truth about your situation. You need to stop talking to reporters if you know what's good for you." Sandra felt a chill run down her spine, but she forced herself to stay calm. Through her earpiece, she could hear Agent Johnson telling her to keep the caller talking. "I don't know what you mean," Sandra said. "I'm just trying to clear my name." "Your name will never be clear if you keep digging into things that don't concern you. Drop the investigation, stop talking to journalists, and accept that sometimes innocent people get caught up in situations beyond their control." "Why should I listen to you?" Sandra asked, following the script the FBI had given her. "Because if you don't, your daughter might find herself in a very dangerous situation. 8-year-old girls can have accidents, especially when their mothers make poor decisions." Sandra's blood turned ice cold. Even though she knew Maya was safe with Mrs. Johnson and under FBI protection, the threat against her daughter made her want to scream. "Leave my daughter out of this," Sandra said, her voice shaking with rage. "That's up to you. Stop the investigation and she stays safe. Keep talking to reporters and we can't guarantee what might happen." The line went dead, and Sandra threw the phone across the room in fury and fear. Through her earpiece, Agent Martinez's voice was calm but urgent. "Sandra, are you okay? We traced the call and units are moving now." Within minutes, Sandra's apartment was full of FBI agents and police officers. Agent Johnson removed her wire and earpiece while Agent Martinez briefed the team on the phone trace results. The call came from a burner phone in a parking garage downtown, Agent Cooper reported. But our surveillance team spotted 3 people leaving the garage immediately after the call ended. We have units following them now. Agent Martinez sat down beside Sandra, who was still shaking from the threat against Maya. "I know that was terrifying, but you did perfectly. That call gives us evidence of obstruction of justice and witness intimidation." "Did we get them?" Sandra asked. "We got some of them," Agent Johnson replied. "The 3 people we're following led us to a warehouse on the south side of the city. It looks like their base of operations." Over the next 2 hours, Sandra waited in her apartment while FBI and police teams raided the warehouse. Through radio communications, she heard updates about arrests, evidence seized, and the scope of the criminal organization they had uncovered. Agent Martinez returned to Sandra's apartment at midnight with a smile on her face. "We got them. All of them." How many people were involved? 12 people in the core organization, including the woman who's been committing the robberies while disguised to look like their targets. We also found computer equipment with stolen identity information for over 200 potential victims. Agent Cooper joined them with a box of evidence. "Look what we found in their files." He showed Sandra a folder with her name on it, containing copies of her driver's license, work schedule, bank records, and dozens of photos taken from her social media accounts and surveillance of her daily routine. "They knew everything about you," Agent Martinez said. "Where you worked, when you would have alibis, what you looked like from every angle. They spent weeks preparing to frame you." "What about the other women who were arrested?" "We're working with prosecutors in Ohio and Indiana to get all charges dropped immediately," Agent Johnson said. "By the end of the week, 17 innocent women will be cleared and released." Sandra felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "And my charges?" "Dropped as of 1 hour ago," Agent Martinez announced. "You're completely free, Sandra. Your record will be expunged, and there will be no trace of these false charges." 3 months later, Sandra sat in a federal courtroom watching as the leader of the identity theft ring was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The woman who had impersonated Sandra and the other victims received 15 years, and the rest of the organization received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years. Patricia Wong's investigative series about the case won a Pulitzer Prize and led to reforms in how police departments handle eyewitness identifications. Sandra testified before Congress about the experience of being wrongfully arrested, and her testimony helped pass legislation requiring better verification of suspect identities. Sandra kept her job at the security company, where her co-workers treated her like a hero for helping catch the criminals. Maya, who had been traumatized by her mother's arrest, gradually returned to her normal, happy childhood with the help of counseling and Sandra's constant reassurance. But perhaps most importantly, Sandra learned that sometimes the system fails innocent people. But when it works properly, justice can prevail. She became an advocate for other wrongfully accused individuals, using her experience to help people navigate the complex and often unfair criminal justice system. On the first anniversary of her arrest, Sandra received a letter from Jennifer Thompson, one of the other women who had been framed by the same organization. Jennifer wrote that she had gotten her life back, returned to her nursing job, and that her children no longer flinched when police cars drove by their house. Sandra had been in county jail for 6 days when she heard her name called over the intercom during lunch. The announcement echoed through the noisy cafeteria where hundreds of inmates were eating from plastic trays and talking in small groups. Sandra looked up from her untouched food, wondering who could possibly be visiting her in the middle of the day. "Williams, Sandra. Report to the administration office immediately," the voice repeated. Sandra's cellmate Maria raised her eyebrows. "That's unusual. They don't usually call people out of lunch unless it's an emergency or something big is happening." Sandra made her way through the jail's maze of corridors, escorted by a guard who seemed as curious as she was about this unexpected summons. The administration office was in a different part of the building than the visiting rooms, and Sandra had never been there before. When she arrived, she was surprised to see 3 people in business suits waiting for her. 2 men and 1 woman, all carrying briefcases and looking very official. They had the kind of serious professional appearance that suggested federal law enforcement rather than local police. "Mrs. Williams, I'm Special Agent Rebecca Martinez with the FBI," the woman said, showing her badge and identification. "These are Special Agents Johnson and Cooper. We need to speak with you about your case." Sandra felt a mixture of hope and confusion. Why would the FBI be interested in a local bank robbery case? "Am I in more trouble now?" "Actually, we think you might be the key to solving a much bigger problem," Agent Martinez replied. "Let's sit down and talk." They were led to a small conference room where Sandra sat across from the 3 federal agents. Agent Martinez opened a laptop computer and pulled out several files thick with documents and photographs. "Mrs. Williams, how much do you know about the other bank robberies that have happened in the city over the past 2 months?" Agent Martinez asked. "The police think I committed them, but I didn't. I was working during all of those robberies, just like I was working during the one they arrested me for." Agent Johnson, a tall black man with graying hair, leaned forward. "We've been investigating a sophisticated identity theft and bank fraud operation that spans multiple states. Your case caught our attention because the pattern matches what we've been tracking." Agent Cooper, a younger white man with sharp eyes, opened one of the files. "Over the past 6 months, there have been 17 bank robberies across Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. In each case, the perpetrator was described as a black woman between 25 and 35 years old, medium height, athletic build." "That could describe thousands of women," Sandra said. "Exactly," Agent Martinez replied. "But here's what's interesting. In every case, within 48 hours of each robbery, police arrested a black woman who matched that description. And in every case, the suspect had a solid alibi but was still charged based on eyewitness identification." Sandra felt her heart racing. "You mean I'm not the only one?" Agent Johnson pulled out a stack of photographs. "Meet Jennifer Thompson from Cleveland, arrested for a bank robbery she didn't commit. She was at work as a nurse when it happened, with dozens of witnesses and security footage. Here's Keisha Davis from Indianapolis, arrested while she was at her daughter's school conference, and Angela Brown from Grand Rapids, who was in court for a traffic ticket when the robbery occurred." Sandra stared at the photos. All of the women looked somewhat similar to her: black, medium build, professional appearance. But they were clearly different people with different lives in different cities. "How is this possible?" Sandra asked. "Are you saying someone is framing all of us?" "We believe there's an organized group using stolen identities to commit these robberies," Agent Martinez explained. "They carefully select targets who match a general description, steal their personal information, and then commit crimes while making sure the victims have solid alibis." Agent Cooper spread out a map showing the locations of all the robberies. "The pattern is too precise to be coincidental. Each target is a working mother, often a veteran or someone with a clean background. The robberies happen during business hours when the targets are at work, making their alibis almost too perfect." "But if our alibis are so good, why are we still getting arrested?" Sandra asked. "Because the eyewitness identifications are incredibly strong," Agent Johnson said. "In each case, the bank teller or customer who witnessed the robbery was absolutely certain about their identification. They didn't just think it was you, they were completely convinced." Agent Martinez turned her laptop screen toward Sandra. "We think we know why. Look at this security footage from the Cleveland robbery." The black and white video showed a woman entering a bank, approaching the teller, and demanding money. The woman wore sunglasses and a baseball cap, but her general appearance was similar to Sandra's. However, something about the footage looked strange. "Watch her movements carefully," Agent Martinez said. "Notice how she keeps her face turned toward the security cameras? Most robbers try to avoid cameras, but this one seems to be posing for them." Sandra watched the footage again and saw what the agent meant. The robber was deliberately showing her profile to the cameras, almost as if she wanted to be recorded. "Now look at this," Agent Cooper said, pulling out a photograph. "This is a frame from the security footage enhanced by our technical team." The enhanced image showed the robber's face more clearly, and Sandra gasped. The woman looked remarkably similar to Sandra, but there were subtle differences in the nose, eye shape, and jawline. Someone is using sophisticated makeup and prosthetics to look like their targets, Agent Martinez explained. They study photos from social media, driver's licenses, and work IDs to create a convincing disguise. Then they commit robberies while making sure witnesses get a good look at their fake face. But how do they know what we look like? Sandra asked. Agent Johnson pulled out another file. Identity theft. They hack into databases, steal personal information, and build detailed profiles of their targets. They know where you work, what you look like, when you'll have alibis, and how to make witnesses identify you instead of them. Sandra felt overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy. So all of us innocent women are sitting in jail while the real criminals are free? That's exactly what's happening, Agent Martinez confirmed. And it gets worse. Each time they successfully frame someone, they get bolder. The robberies are getting more frequent and the amounts stolen are getting larger. Agent Cooper leaned back in his chair. We've been working this case for 3 months, but local police departments don't want to hear that they arrested the wrong person. It's embarrassing and expensive to admit mistakes. So what happens to me? Sandra asked. Do I just stay in jail while you investigate? That's where you can help us, Agent Martinez said. We need someone on the inside who can help us catch these people. Someone they've already targeted who can help us set a trap. Sandra felt a flicker of hope mixed with fear. What kind of trap? We think they're monitoring their targets even after the arrests, Agent Johnson explained. They want to make sure the frame jobs stick. If we can make them think you're about to expose their operation, they might make a mistake. Agent Martinez pulled out a legal document. We're prepared to work with the local prosecutor to get you released on bail so you can help us. But Sandra, I won't lie to you. This could be dangerous. These people have put 17 innocent women in jail to cover their tracks. They won't hesitate to hurt you if they think you're a threat. Sandra thought about Maya, who had been asking Mrs. Johnson every day when her mother was coming home. She thought about the other innocent women sitting in jails across 3 states, separated from their families because of these criminals. What do you need me to do? Agent Cooper smiled for the first time since entering the room. First, we get you out of here. Then we turn you into bait. Agent Martinez closed her laptop. Mrs. Williams, we should warn you that even after we catch these people, clearing your name completely could take time. The legal system moves slowly, and some prosecutors don't like admitting they were wrong. But you can prove I'm innocent? We can prove you're a victim of a sophisticated conspiracy, Agent Johnson said. Whether that's enough to satisfy everyone involved remains to be seen. Sandra realized that even with FBI involvement, her nightmare might not be over quickly. But for the first time in a week, she had hope that someone with real power believed in her innocence and was willing to fight for her. When do we start? Sandra asked. Agent Martinez gathered her files. We make some phone calls this afternoon. If everything goes according to plan, you should be home with your daughter by tomorrow evening. Sandra felt tears of relief and gratitude forming in her eyes. She was going to see Maya again, and she was going to help catch the people who had destroyed so many innocent lives. But she also knew that the most dangerous part of this ordeal was just beginning. The courthouse was a massive gray building that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who entered its halls. Sandra sat in the defendant's holding area, wearing an orange jail jumpsuit that felt like a costume from someone else's nightmare. She had been awake since 5 a.m., when guards had transported her from the police station to the county jail, and then to court for her arraignment. Sandra looked around the holding cell and saw other defendants waiting for their turn before the judge. Some looked scared, others angry, and a few seemed resigned to their fate. She didn't belong here with these people, but the justice system had already decided she was just another criminal waiting to be processed. When her name was called, Sandra was led into the courtroom wearing handcuffs and leg shackles that made walking difficult. The courtroom was filled with lawyers, police officers, and family members of other defendants. She scanned the gallery looking for a friendly face, but saw only strangers. Judge Patricia Reynolds was a stern-looking woman in her 60s, with silver hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. She had the tired expression of someone who had seen thousands of defendants over the years and had heard every excuse imaginable. The defendant will stand, the bailiff announced as Sandra approached the defendant's table where her public defender, Lisa Park, was, waiting with a stack of legal documents. Mrs. Williams, you are charged with armed robbery in the 1st degree, a felony punishable by up to 20 years in prison, Judge Reynolds read from her paperwork. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor, Sandra said clearly, her military training helping her maintain composure despite her terror. Assistant District Attorney Michael Ross stood up from the prosecution table. He was a young man in an expensive suit who looked like he was trying to make a name for himself, with high-profile convictions. Your Honor, the state requests that the defendant be held without bail. Mrs. Williams is suspected in a series of bank robberies across the city, making her a danger to the community. She also has military training with weapons, increasing the risk of violence if she's released. Sandra felt like screaming. Her military service, which should have been proof of her good character, was being twisted to make her seem more dangerous. Lisa Park stood up to respond. Your Honor, my client is a decorated military veteran with no criminal history whatsoever. She has strong ties to the community, including an 8-year-old daughter who needs her care. She has been employed steadily since leaving the military and has clear alibi evidence showing she was at work during the time of the alleged robbery. The state has video evidence from the defendant's workplace, but the footage is inconclusive, Prosecutor Ross countered. The eyewitness identification is very strong, and we have evidence of recent financial stress that provides motive for these crimes. Judge Reynolds reviewed the documents in front of her for several minutes while Sandra stood waiting, her heart pounding. The judge's decision would determine whether Sandra went home to her daughter or remained locked up for months waiting for trial. Given the serious nature of the charges and the possibility of additional charges being filed, I'm setting bail at $250,000, Judge Reynolds finally announced. Next case. Sandra felt her knees go weak. $250,000 might as well have been $2 million. She made $35,000 a year as a security guard and had less than $3,000 in her savings account. There was no way she could afford bail, even with a bail bondsman who would typically require 10% down. As Sandra was led back to the holding area, Lisa Park caught up with her. I'm sorry, Sandra. I had hoped for a lower amount, but Judge Reynolds is known for setting high bail in robbery cases. What happens now? Sandra asked, fighting back tears. You'll be transferred to county jail to await trial. I'll keep working on your case and looking for evidence to prove your innocence. In the meantime, try to stay safe and keep your head down. Sandra was transported to the county jail in a van with 6 other defendants, all of them shackled together like a chain gang from an old movie. The jail was even worse than the police station holding cell, overcrowded, noisy, and filled with the smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with human desperation. During processing, Sandra was strip-searched, given a medical examination, and assigned to a cell with 2 other women. Her cellmates were Maria, a young woman charged with drug possession, and Janet, an older woman who had been arrested for shoplifting. Both seemed surprised when Sandra told them she was charged with bank robbery. You don't look like a bank robber, Maria said. You look like a teacher or something. I'm not a bank robber, Sandra replied. Someone made a mistake and I'm stuck here until it gets sorted out. Janet, who had been through the system before, shook her head sadly. Honey, mistakes don't get sorted out quick in here. You better get comfortable and learn the rules if you want to survive. Over the next few days, Sandra learned the harsh realities of jail life. She had to fight for phone time to call Mrs. Johnson and check on Maya. She had to navigate complex social hierarchies among the inmates. She had to eat terrible food and try to sleep despite constant noise and the bright lights that never went completely dark. On her 4th day in jail, Sandra received an unexpected visitor. Officer Brooks, the sympathetic police officer who had escorted her during the investigation, appeared at the visiting room looking nervous and glancing around as if she didn't want to be seen. Mrs. Williams, I probably shouldn't be here, but something's been bothering me about your case, Officer Brooks said quietly. Sandra leaned forward eagerly. What do you mean? I've been a police officer for 8 years, and I've seen a lot of cases. Usually when someone is guilty, there are loose ends, inconsistencies in their story, or evidence that doesn't quite fit. But in your case, everything points to innocence except for that one eyewitness identification. The bank teller who identified me, Sandra said. Right, and that's what's strange. I pulled the case file for the other bank robberies they think you might be connected to. Different witnesses, different banks, but the descriptions are all very similar. And in each case, the witness was absolutely certain about their identification. Sandra felt a spark of hope. What are you saying? Officer Brooks looked around again to make sure no one was listening. I'm saying maybe these robberies are connected, But not in the way the detectives think. What if someone is deliberately targeting witnesses who would identify the same type of person? What if someone is using your identity and appearance as cover? You mean someone who looks like me is committing these robberies? Or someone who's making sure witnesses remember someone who looks like you, Brooks said. I've seen cases where criminals plant fake IDs or photos at crime scenes to throw off investigations. Identity theft is more sophisticated than people think. Sandra's mind raced with possibilities. So you think someone is deliberately framing me? I think there are questions that aren't being asked, Brooks replied carefully. But I'm just a patrol officer. The detectives have already decided you're guilty and they're not interested in alternative theories. Can you help me? Can you investigate these other possibilities? Officer Brooks looked conflicted. I can't officially investigate a case that's been assigned to other detectives, but I can do some checking on my own time. Look into the other robbery cases, see if there are patterns the detectives missed. Please, Sandra begged. My daughter needs me home. I didn't do this, and whoever really did these robberies is still out there. Brooks nodded. I'll see what I can find. But Mrs. Williams, you need to be prepared for the possibility that even if I find evidence of your innocence, it might not be enough. The system doesn't like to admit mistakes, especially high-profile ones. After Officer Brooks left, Sandra felt a mixture of hope and frustration. Finally, someone in law enforcement believed her. But that person was just a patrol officer with no authority to change her situation. Sandra was beginning to understand that proving her innocence would require more than just evidence. It would require someone with enough power and influence to force the system to listen. That night, lying in her narrow jail bunk while her cellmates slept, Sandra stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine who might want to frame her for bank robbery. She had no enemies that she knew of, no one who would want to see her in prison. But someone had stolen her identity and was using it to commit crimes, and that person was still free while Sandra rotted in jail for their actions. The next morning, Sandra was awakened by the sound of keys rattling against the cell bars. She had barely slept on the hard bench, her mind racing with worry about Maya and confusion about why she was still locked up, despite having a solid alibi. The other women in the cell were still sleeping, and the holding area was quiet except for the distant sounds of the busy police station above. Williams. Let's go, said Officer Brooks, a young black woman who seemed more sympathetic than the others Sandra had encountered. Detective Martinez wants to see you again. Sandra followed Officer Brooks back to the same interrogation room where she had spent hours the day before. This time, Detective Martinez wasn't alone. A woman in a dark suit sat beside him, her expression serious and professional. She had short brown hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail. Mrs. Williams, this is Detective Sarah Coleman from Internal Affairs, Martinez said, as Sandra sat down across from them. She has some questions about your case. Sandra felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Internal Affairs was looking into why she was still being held despite clear evidence of her innocence. Detective Coleman, I hope you can help clear this up. My supervisor brought security footage yesterday proving I was at work when this robbery happened. Detective Coleman opened a laptop computer and turned it toward Sandra. We've reviewed the footage from your workplace. Can you tell me what you see here? Sandra looked at the screen and saw grainy black and white security footage from her office building. The timestamp showed November 15th, 2:25 p.m., right around the time of the bank robbery. She could see herself clearly sitting at the security desk in the lobby, checking visitors' IDs and monitoring the building's cameras. That's me at my desk. Exactly where I told you I was, Sandra said, pointing at the screen. This proves I couldn't have robbed that bank. Detective Coleman paused the video and zoomed in on Sandra's face. The quality isn't very good, is it? The image is blurry and it's hard to make out specific features. Sandra stared at the detective in disbelief. But you can clearly see it's me. My supervisor identified me. I'm wearing my security uniform. I'm at my assigned workstation. What we see is a black woman in a security uniform sitting at a desk, Coleman replied. But the image quality makes it difficult to definitively identify who that person is. Detective Martinez leaned forward. Your keycard records show someone using your card that day, but keycard access doesn't prove identity. Someone else could have used your card. Sandra felt like she was living in a nightmare. Who else would use my keycard? Why would someone else be doing my job? This is insane. You have video evidence, keycard records, and my supervisor's testimony. What more do you need? The bank teller who was robbed is very credible, Martinez said. She works for a respected financial institution, has no criminal record, and was completely certain when she identified you. She said she got a clear look at the robber's face. But she was traumatized and scared, Sandra protested. People make mistakes when they're under stress. Eyewitness identification is notoriously unreliable. Detective Coleman closed the laptop. We also found something interesting when we ran your background check. You've been having financial difficulties recently. Sandra's confusion deepened. What financial difficulties? I pay my bills on time. I have no debt except my car payment and some student loans from my military education benefits. Coleman pulled out a document. Your credit report shows you applied for a personal loan 3 weeks ago and were denied due to insufficient income. I never applied for any loan, Sandra said firmly. I don't need a loan. Show me that application. The detective slid the paper across the table. Sandra looked at it and saw her name, address, and social security number on a loan application for $5,000. But the signature wasn't hers and some of the information was wrong. This isn't my signature, Sandra said, pointing to the bottom of the form. And this employment information is incorrect. It says I work at a restaurant downtown, but I work security at Midtown Financial Plaza. Anyone can claim a signature isn't theirs, Martinez replied dismissively. Sandra was beginning to understand that these detectives had already made up their minds about her guilt. No amount of evidence would convince them otherwise. I want to speak to a lawyer. I'm not answering any more questions. That's your right, Coleman said. But I should tell you that we're also investigating whether this was part of a larger pattern. There have been 3 other bank robberies in the city over the past month, all involving black women matching your general description. Sandra's heart sank. They weren't just trying to pin one robbery on her. They thought she was a serial bank robber. I didn't rob 1 bank, let alone 4 banks. Check my work schedule for all those dates. Check where I was. We're looking into that, Coleman said. But her tone suggested she wasn't really interested in Sandra's alibi for the other robberies. After the detectives left, Sandra was returned to her holding cell where she waited for hours to speak with a public defender. When attorney Lisa Park finally arrived, she looked overwhelmed and exhausted, carrying a stack of case files that suggested she had too many clients and not enough time. Mrs. Williams, I'm Lisa Park from the public defender's office. I've been assigned to your case, she said, sitting down across from Sandra in a small conference room. I've reviewed the police reports and I have to be honest. The evidence against you is concerning. Sandra felt her hope deflating. But I have an alibi. I was at work when this happened. The security footage is grainy, and the police are questioning whether it definitively shows you or someone else using your keycard and wearing your uniform, Park explained. And the eyewitness identification is very strong evidence. Juries tend to believe victims. The victim made a mistake, Sandra insisted. I've never even been to that bank. Attorney Park flipped through her notes. The prosecution is also going to argue that you had motive. They found evidence of financial stress, including a recent loan application. I didn't apply for any loan. Someone stole my identity to fill out that application. Do you have any proof of identity theft? Police reports, credit monitoring alerts, anything like that? Sandra shook her head. She had never had reason to monitor her credit closely before. I didn't know someone was using my information until the detective showed me that fake loan application. Park made some notes. The arraignment is scheduled for tomorrow morning. The prosecution will likely ask for high bail, given that they suspect you're involved in multiple robberies. I'll argue for release on your own recognizance based on your military service and lack of criminal history. What are my chances of getting out of here tomorrow? Honestly, not great. Bank robbery is a serious federal crime, and if they think you're part of a pattern, the judge will see you as a flight risk. Sandra felt tears forming in her eyes for the first time since this ordeal began. My daughter needs me. She's only 8 years old and she's staying with a neighbor who barely knows her. I'll mention your daughter in my arguments tomorrow, Park promised. But Mrs. Williams, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that you'll be held until trial. These cases can take months to resolve. That night, lying on the hard bench in her cell, Sandra stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of what was happening to her. Someone had stolen her identity to apply for a loan. Someone who looked like her had robbed a bank while she was at work. The police had video evidence proving her innocence, but they were choosing to ignore it. For the first time, Sandra began to wonder, If this wasn't just a case of mistaken identity, someone seemed to be deliberately framing her, and she had no idea who or why. But more importantly, she was beginning to realize that the truth alone might not be enough to save her from spending years in prison for crimes she didn't commit. Detective Martinez sat across from Sandra in the cramped interrogation room, his eyes studying her face for any sign of guilt. Sandra had been sitting in the cold room for 3 hours and her wrist still ached from the handcuffs. She kept thinking about Maya, who would be waiting for her at after-school care, wondering why her mother hadn't come to pick her up. "Let's go through this again," Detective Martinez said, tapping his pen against the metal table. "Yesterday, November 15th at approximately 2:30 p.m., a black woman matching your description entered First National Bank on Oak Street. She approached teller Jennifer Morrison, showed a gun, and demanded money. The teller handed over $837 in cash and the suspect fled on foot." Sandra leaned forward in her chair, her voice steady despite her growing frustration. "Detective, I understand what you're telling me, but I was at work yesterday afternoon. I clock in at 8 a.m. and don't leave until 6 p.m. My supervisor is Robert Chen, and there are security cameras everywhere in our building. I work security for Midtown Financial Plaza on 3rd Street. Anyone can say they were at work," Martinez replied, dismissing her alibi. "People lie to protect themselves all the time." "Then check it," Sandra said firmly. "Call my supervisor. Look at the security footage. My keycard records when I enter and leave the building. Everything is tracked." Detective Martinez made a note in his file but didn't seem convinced. "The victim was very certain when she picked you out of the lineup. She got a good look at the robber and said she was absolutely sure it was you." Sandra felt a chill run down her spine. How could someone be certain about identifying her for a crime she didn't commit?
"Did she pick me out of a photo lineup or did she see me in person?"
"Photo lineup. 6 pictures and she pointed to yours immediately. No hesitation." "Detective, with respect, photo lineups can be wrong. People make mistakes when they're scared and traumatized. I've never robbed anyone, and I've never even been inside that bank." "Where did you get my photo for the lineup?" Martinez flipped through his file. "Your driver's license photo was in our database. The description matched: black female, 5'6", medium build, short hair." Sandra almost laughed, but the situation was too serious. That description could fit thousands of women in this city. And driver's license photos all look terrible. I look completely different in real life than I do in that picture. The detective wasn't interested in her reasoning. He pulled out another document and slid it across the table. "Your military record shows you were trained in weapons handling. You know how to use firearms." "Yes, I was military police. I was trained to protect people, not rob them. I served my country for 6 years and came home with an honorable discharge. I have commendation medals for my service in Afghanistan. Sometimes veterans come back and have trouble adjusting. Maybe you needed money, got desperate." Sandra felt anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. Getting emotional would only hurt her case. "I'm not desperate for money. I have a steady job and I support my daughter just fine. My bank records will show regular deposits from my paycheck and no unusual expenses or debts." Detective Martinez continued pressing her with questions, trying different approaches to get her to confess. He suggested that maybe she didn't remember committing the robbery due to stress or mental health issues. He implied that cooperating now would be better for her in the long run. He even suggested that maybe she had an accomplice who forced her to do it. "I need to make a phone call," Sandra said after another hour of interrogation. "I have a right to call someone and my daughter is waiting for me to pick her up from school." "You'll get your phone call when we're finished here," Martinez replied. "We are finished here. I've told you everything I can tell you. I didn't rob that bank. Check my alibi at work. Check my bank records. Check whatever you need to check. But I'm not saying anything else without a lawyer present." Detective Martinez looked annoyed. "Asking for a lawyer makes you look guilty. No, it makes me look smart. I'm a law-abiding citizen who knows my rights." Finally, Martinez led Sandra to a phone in the hallway. Her hand shook as she dialed her neighbor Mrs. Johnson's number, hoping the elderly woman would be home and willing to help. "Mrs. Johnson, this is Sandra from next door. I'm in trouble and I need you to do me a huge favor. Can you pick up Maya from after-school care and keep her overnight?" "Oh, honey, what happened?" "I saw them take you away in handcuffs this morning. They think I robbed a bank, but it's all a mistake. It'll get sorted out, but I need someone to take care of Maya until then." Mrs. Johnson agreed immediately, and Sandra gave her the school's information. At least her daughter would be safe and cared for while this nightmare continued. Sandra was then taken to a holding cell in the basement of the police station. The cell was small and dirty, with graffiti scratched into the walls and a strong smell of disinfectant that couldn't quite cover the underlying odors of human misery. There were 2 other women in the cell, one sleeping on the hard bench and another pacing nervously near the bars. The pacing woman, who looked to be in her 40s with blonde hair and tired eyes, noticed Sandra's distressed expression. "First time? Hopefully the only time," Sandra replied, sitting down on the cold concrete bench. "They think I robbed a bank." "Did you?" "No. Someone identified me in a photo lineup, but I was at work when it happened." The woman nodded sympathetically. "Mistaken identity happens more than people think. The system isn't perfect, especially for people like us." Sandra understood what she meant. Being a black woman in the criminal justice system came with extra challenges and assumptions. She had hoped her military service and clean record would protect her, but sitting in this cell made her realize that none of that mattered right now. Hours passed slowly. Sandra tried to stay positive, telling herself that once the police checked her alibi at work, everything would be cleared up. Her supervisor, Robert Chen, was a good man who would vouch for her. The security cameras would show her at work during the time of the robbery. Her keycard records would prove she never left the building. But as the day turned into evening and no one came to release her, Sandra began to worry. What if the police didn't bother to check her alibi? What if they thought they had their suspect and didn't want to look any further? She had heard stories of innocent people spending months or even years in jail waiting for their cases to be resolved. Around 9 o'clock that night, a guard came to the cell. "Williams, you have a visitor." Sandra was led to a small visiting room where she found Robert Chen, her supervisor from work, sitting at a metal table looking concerned and confused. "Sandra, what is this about?" "The police came to the office today asking questions about you and some bank robbery." "Mr. Chen, thank you for coming. They think I robbed a bank yesterday afternoon around 2:30. I told them I was at work, but they don't believe me." "Did you tell them I was there?" "Of course I did. I showed them the security footage of you at your desk yesterday afternoon. I gave them copies of your keycard records showing you never left the building between noon and 6 p.m. Sandra felt a wave of relief. "So they have proof I couldn't have done it?" Robert Chen looked puzzled. "That's what I thought. But they didn't seem interested in the evidence. The detective just took the footage and said they'd review it." "But Sandra, if you have a clear alibi, why are you still here?" That was exactly what Sandra was wondering. If the police had video evidence proving she was at work during the robbery, why hadn't they released her? Something was very wrong with this whole situation, and Sandra was beginning to realize that the truth might not be enough to set her free. Sandra Williams had served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a military police officer. She came back home to Detroit with medals on her chest and scars that nobody could see. After leaving the Army, she worked as a security guard at a downtown office building, trying to build a quiet life for herself and her 8-year-old daughter, Maya. On a cold Tuesday morning in November, Sandra was running late for work. She had dropped Maya off at school and was rushing to catch the bus when she realized she had forgotten her security badge at home. Without it, she couldn't get into the building or do her job. She quickly turned around and headed back to her apartment, walking fast through the familiar neighborhood streets. Sandra lived in a working-class area where most people knew each other. The houses were old but well-kept, with small front yards and chain-link fences. She had lived there for 2 years since getting out of the military, and her neighbors were friendly. Mrs. Johnson next door always waved from her window, and the kids on the block knew her as the lady who sometimes gave out candy on Halloween. As Sandra approached her apartment building, she noticed a police car parked across the street. This wasn't unusual in her neighborhood, but something felt different today. The officer inside the car seemed to be watching her building specifically. Sandra didn't think much of it at first. She had always respected law enforcement, having worked alongside police officers during her military service. She climbed the steps to her second-floor apartment and unlocked the door. Inside, everything was exactly as she had left it 30 minutes earlier. Maya's breakfast bowl was still on the table, and Sandra's work uniform was hanging on the bedroom door. She grabbed her security badge from the kitchen counter, where she had accidentally left it next to her coffee mug. Just as Sandra was about to leave again, she heard heavy footsteps on the stairs outside. Then came a loud, aggressive knock on her door. The sound was so forceful that it made her heart jump. She looked through the peephole and saw 3 police officers standing in the hallway, all wearing serious expressions. "Police, open the door," one of them shouted. Sandra was confused but compliant. She had never been in trouble with the law, not even a speeding ticket. As a veteran, she had been trained to follow orders and respect authority. She opened the door slowly, keeping her hands visible. "Are you Sandra Williams?" the lead officer asked. He was a tall, heavy-set man with a stern face and cold eyes. "Yes, that's me. Is everything okay?" "Did something happen to my daughter?" Sandra's first thought was that maybe there had been an emergency at Maya's school. "You need to come with us," the officer said, stepping forward into her doorway without being invited in. "Come with you where?" "What's this about?" Sandra asked, genuinely confused. She noticed that all 3 officers had their hands near their weapons, which made her nervous. "You're under arrest for armed robbery," the lead officer announced, pulling out handcuffs. Sandra felt like the world had stopped spinning. "Armed robbery? There must be some mistake. I've never robbed anyone in my life. I'm a veteran. I work security downtown." "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," the officer ordered, ignoring her protests. Sandra's military training kicked in. Even though every fiber of her being wanted to argue and demand an explanation, she knew that resisting would only make things worse. She turned around and allowed the officer to handcuff her, the metal cold against her. "Wrists, you have the right to remain silent." The officer began reading her. Miranda rights as neighbors started peeking out of their doors to see what was happening. "Can I at least call my work to tell them I won't be in?" "And someone needs to pick up my daughter from school," Sandra pleaded as they escorted her down the stairs. "You can make your phone calls at the station," the officer replied curtly. As they walked toward the police car, Sandra saw Mrs. Johnson watching from her window with a shocked expression. Other neighbors had come outside, some recording with their phones. Sandra felt humiliated and confused. This had to be a case of mistaken identity. She had never even been inside a bank except to deposit her paychecks. The officers placed her in the back of the police car, and Sandra noticed that more patrol cars had arrived. It seemed like overkill for someone they thought had committed a robbery, especially since she had cooperated completely. The back seat smelled like disinfectant and fear, and Sandra found herself thinking about Maya. Her daughter would be expecting her to pick her up from after-school care at 6 o'clock. During the 20-minute ride to the police station, Sandra tried to think of any reason why she might be suspected of armed robbery. She had been at work yesterday, same as every day. She had surveillance footage and coworkers who could vouch for her whereabouts. This would all be cleared up quickly, she told herself. The police station was busy and noisy, filled with officers, civilians, and the constant sound of ringing phones. Sandra was processed like any other criminal suspect, despite her protests of innocence. They took her fingerprints, photographed her from multiple angles, and confiscated her personal belongings, including her phone. "When can I call someone about my daughter?" Sandra asked the booking officer, a tired-looking woman with graying hair. "After you're processed and placed in a holding cell, you'll get your phone call," the woman replied without looking up from her paperwork. Sandra was then led to a small, windowless interrogation room where she waited alone for what felt like hours. The room had concrete walls painted an ugly shade of green, a metal table bolted to the floor, and 2 uncomfortable chairs. A camera in the corner recorded everything, its red light blinking steadily. When Detective Martinez finally entered the room, he carried a thick file folder and wore an expression that suggested he already believed Sandra was guilty. He was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of too many years dealing with criminals. "Mrs. Williams, I'm Detective Martinez. We need to talk about the robbery that happened yesterday at First National Bank on Oak Street." "I've never been to that bank in my life," Sandra said immediately. "I bank at the credit union near my work. Check my account records. Check the security cameras at my job. I was working yesterday from 8 in the morning until 6 at night." Detective Martinez opened his file and pulled out a photograph. "The victim identified you from a photo lineup as the person who robbed her at gunpoint." Sandra stared at the photo in disbelief. It was clearly her driver's license picture, but she couldn't understand how anyone could identify her as a robber when she had never committed a crime in her life.